Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Welcome to the Teammate Apart podcast, the podcast designed to teach freelancers, contractors, and remote workers, really anyone working apart, how to build better relationships with those they work with and those they work for. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. Before we get started, financial support for the Teammate Apart podcast Season 2 is provided by R2, a fully distributed brand relationship consultancy. R2 has specific expertise and experience in helping service companies grow, develop, and maintain impactful relationships through world-class brand strategy and design. R2 supports the world's best distributed companies by providing valuable insights, strategy, empathy, and tactical expertise to help them foster truly meaningful relationships from top management to top consumer. If the success of your business depends on the relationships you make, then you need R2. To learn more or to request a call, simply visit r2mg.com/podcast. That's r2mg.com/podcast. R2, relationships squared. Also, financial support comes from teammateapart.com. Leveraging 20 plus years of global agency and creative hiring expertise, Teammate Apart provides distributed organizations with access to the best and brightest creative talent from around the world. Through deep understanding of client needs and meaningful relationships with talent, Teammate Apart facilitates a sort of virtual handshake between prospective employer and prospective employee to reduce risk and eliminate doubt from creative hiring decisions. Take a step towards filling that creative-shaped void in your distributed team by visiting teammateapart.com/talent. That's teammateapart.com/talent to learn more. Finally, financial support comes from supporters like you. Members of our Happy Little Podcast community can make contributions directly to the show by visiting teammateapart.com/podcast and clicking on the donation link. Donations can be in any amount and go a long way towards keeping this show on the air. If you appreciate the work we're doing and would like to get involved, just visit teammateapart.com/podcast, click the donate button, and you're on your way. Thank you for your continued support. And now, on to the show. Hey there, and welcome back to the show. Today's special guest is co-founder and director of Amal, Lorraine Charles. Lorraine is an expert in the political economy, education, and the development of digital livelihoods for refugees in the Middle East. She is a research associate at the Center for Business Research, University of Cambridge, and the Geneva Center for Security Policy on the Syria Transitions Challenges Project. Additionally, Lorraine is the project manager for Basmat Amal, a volunteer education and livelihood project that provides support to vulnerable Syrian families in Abu Dhabi. She has worked as a consultant with NGOs, INGOs, and government entities, as well as in academia and the private sector. Here to talk about leveraging remote work as a way to support refugee and other vulnerable populations, issues surrounding finding opportunities for them, and motivation for employers trying to find the right people with the right skills right now. Please join me in welcoming Lorraine Charles to the show. Hi, Lorraine. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
I am so glad to have you. You've been one of those elusive people I've been trying to track down, since the inception of our original podcast. One thing that I discovered really early on in sort of what I guess now I'm calling my remote work advocacy was the opportunities present for people who are living in sort of economically disparaged or war-torn or, for whatever reason, difficult parts of the world, and how they might be able to leverage remote work as a way to, improve their lives. And you, I think, are uniquely qualified to talk about this stuff. You're doing a lot of work yourself. So maybe let's start a little bit talking about who you are and where you are and what you do.
So I live in the UAE. I've been here for a number of years. I've lived in the Middle East for quite a long time. And initially, I would say I'm not a social entrepreneur. I didn't set out to create an initiative to support people or to have any sort of business. I'm a researcher and an academic. And I started doing research on the Syrian refugee crisis in 2011, from a very academic perspective, looking at gender, looking at education, and looking at, and sort of looking at very much the political context. And then I got a job with a US/UK NGO, where I was looking at the role of the private sector to support education for Syrian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. And then and doing this research and sort of doing the partnerships within this ecosystem, I realized that there was, as the refugee ages, there's less funding that goes toward that type of education, but also fewer refugees entering, higher education. So the other startling thing was there was very little focus on what happens beyond education. So there's, refugees entering traditional education pathways, but also I saw some great programs with training for refugees in tech, in computer literacy, in lots of things, great training programs, but there was no link to employment. And in Jordan and Turkey, where I did my initial research, there are many restrictions that prevent refugees from working in those places. So not only is the economy not large enough to absorb them, they're just mechanisms that prevent them from working legally. So many refugees end up working informally, in precarious conditions, and really in very difficult circumstances. And having worked remotely myself for a number of years, I thought, well, these two things can go together. How can we bring the global private sector to support refugees to work remotely? So this is where the idea of my organization came about. And I looked around, and there were great programs that provided the technical skills. But there were two things which I saw missing. There was no support for helping refugees understand what it means to be a remote worker. What are the skills we need to work remotely? And having worked remotely myself, it's not easy, difficult. Timing, everything is, it's quite a challenge. And the refugees that I sort of spoke to kind of have very traditional education backgrounds. So the idea of working remotely, autonomously, very difficult. So this was the gap. What are the soft skills, professional skills, life skills that refugees require to work remotely? And the other big gap is access to jobs, access to the remote work ecosystem. So at this time, I was doing lots of research, looking at the remote work ecosystem, looking at what refugees were doing, and and then the gap was obvious. So the first gap was the skills. So this is how I sort of formed NAML, working in partnership with other organizations to provide the soft skills, this life skills for refugees to work remotely. The other big gap was there's an amazing remote ecosystem out there, which are part of this, of your podcast, but none of these really understood or really realized that hiring a refugee would be possible. So in the early days, when I started speaking to people, I said, "Oh, refugees working remotely." They say, "Wow, that's an amazing idea. How can we do this?" So I realized the big gap. So that's kind of what we're trying to do: bridge that gap. And NAML is an Arabic word meaning we work. So how can we provide work for refugees? So what we do essentially is through our partners, and this is one thing I strongly believe in: partnerships, very, very important. I can't do everything on my own. I just don't have the skills, the capacity, the time. Partnerships are the way NAML's ecosystem works. Through our strategic partnerships, we have, organizations and NGOs that provide the skills. So our sort of remote work training partners, Workplace Less, we've adapted their curriculum, so refugees go through the self-paced course. This is supported by workshops because, of course, while the self-paced course can be great for native English speakers or for people who actually understand the ecosystem, not quite the same for refugees. So we sort of support the self-paced course with workshops, virtual workshops. We also have a partner NGO called Paper Airplanes provide English support because, again, realizing that remote work English is a language. The refugees need to have the right level of English. So we have a language partner. And then we also work with technical partners. So we don't do the technical training ourselves. We work with different organizations that provide the technical skills. So right now, our project in Jordan, our main partner is a French NGO called Shams that trains refugees in coding. So they are junior web developers. So after they finish the training, technical training, soft skills training, then we place them in paid internships. So this is where we are now. So this is our first project, both of ours. They're just finishing the program now, and we're hoping, they will have paid internships with remote companies. And again, supporting them with the idea of how to work remotely. We have remote mentorship. So professionals from companies providing mentorship for our program participants, again, to further reinforce the skills to work remotely. And again, the mentorship curriculum is based on the same skills that they learn in the workplace/soft skills program, just to reinforce the skills. And things like communication, cross-cultural communication, time management, how to organize your workday, these are the really important skills which they need to do. Autonomy, a big thing, because most of them would have never worked independently on their own, because most come from traditional education backgrounds where the education is very much teacher-centered. So how do you then transition to working on your own? And those who have had jobs, have had a traditional job, you go to an office, you have a boss. You didn't, you have someone telling you what to do every day. How do you then transition to a place where you're on your own, in your home or wherever you are, with your laptop, and your boss is a million miles away? How can you then work and, navigate that space? So this is why, we sort of train them in all these skills, and autonomy is one of the big elements of what we try to provide.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I wonder if we could maybe step back. There's a lot of things in there to unpack. First, can you sort of just, and maybe this sounds kind of dumb, but can we break down, what does this refugee population look like? Who are these people? I think, for a lot of people, especially here in the West, we don't, there's definitely refugee populations here in our country, but
Yes.
we don't, I think what we get is sort of the media version of them, right? These are the people who are traipsing across borders to try and escape some sort of repression, whether it's financial or political or whatever. And I think, we have sort of this vision of who they are, but who is this population of people that we're trying to help? And I guess maybe it would help us to understand better who they are.
So globally, there are 25 million refugees in the world, and this number is growing daily. People flee their home every day, every hour. And refugees are given that status because they're fleeing repression, conflict. In the West, there's a narrative of refugees fleeing for financial reasons. That's not a refugee. That's an economic migrant. Refugees flee because they have fear for their lives. That's why refugees flee. So most refugees live in countries adjacent to where they come from. So if we look at the Middle East, which is where I predominantly work, Syrian refugees are the largest population of refugees. So I think right now they're the second or third largest population of refugees in the world. There are 5 to 6 million refugees, Syrian refugees, in the world now. Jordan has about 700,000 registered refugees and approximately the same who are not registered. So Jordan, a country of 9 million, has approximately 1.5 million refugees. Turkey, I think population of Turkey is 20 million, 30 million. They have 4 to 5 million refugees. Lebanon, a population of 4 million, has 1.5 million refugees. In Lebanon, 1 in every 4 people is a refugee.
Oh, wow.
So in the West, when we think of a refugee crisis, and particularly Europe, America hasn't had the same experience with the Syrian crisis as Europe has. When Germany says they've taken 1 million refugees, when all the other countries have battling with refugees fleeing to their countries, it is nothing like the Middle East is experiencing. And that's one thing I always try to say to people, in Europe, when I go back to Europe, when I speak to my friends, they complain about refugees. I'm like, you have no idea. In Lebanon, 1 in every 4 people is a refugee. And in Africa, it's the same. A lot of refugees live in Kenya, in Uganda, and these are developing countries without the resources that we have in the West. So these countries are doing a phenomenal job to host refugees. And, so again, talking about the Middle East, which is what I work on at the moment, the protectionist labor market mechanisms is to protect, it's to protect the local population, because there aren't enough jobs for the local population. Refugees coming in puts an extra burden on the society. So it's understandable well, kind of that, that countries are, are sort of want to impose these rules just to protect the local population.
Sure.
And hence, and hence why the idea of looking for alternatives. And with remote work, we aren't just serving the refugees, we can also serve the local population, provide money to the country. So not just to the refugee population, but to the local population. And in the programs, we sort of serve both communities.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that helps a little bit to sort of just kind of frame out, maybe I guess the scale of the problem for one, and then just sort of, to try and start wrapping our heads a little bit around who this population is. So what is the goal of, like, for example, take just sort of an average refugee, somebody who's fled their country, they're now living somewhere abroad. I mean, is the goal to get back home one day? Is the goal to just start to lay down roots in their new, in their host country? Like, because I think, remote work is great. And obviously remote work is a way for these people to, begin to generate an income and start to build what you call a digital livelihood, which I just love. I think that's great.
Yes.
And
yes.
But I think, I guess I'm just trying to understand kind of what the goal is, right? So, I mean, they begin working, but what are they working for?
So again, a very good question, but again, very complicated. So if we try to unpack that. So when a refugee flees home, there's sort of three, UNHCR has what they call 3 durable solutions. There is local integration, where they integrate into the country in which they have fled. There's repatriation, where they go back to their home country, or there's resettlement. The resettlement quotas are very small. So that's when, through the UN system and the International Organization for Migration, they move from where, their host country to a third country. They go to Europe, they go to America, and in the past, the US had been the largest resettlement country. But of course, with the administration, the numbers have decreased significantly. Canada's, so Canada still has, Canada has a great program for resettlement, but also their private sponsorship program. So Canada has, takes a lot more than going to Europe through the UNHCR resettlement system, but that's only for very, very few. So most refugees either have to stay where they are, or eventually, when it's safe, go home. But so, for example, for Syria, the UN does not recommend repatriation because it's not safe to return. Repatriation is only recommended when it's safe to return. So as a result, most refugees stay where they are. And refugee camps were initially set up to be temporary, but refugee camps have become permanent. A Kakuma in Kenya, it's almost a permanent settlement. And the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Palestinians have been refugees for 70 years. So while a lot of Palestinians have sort of, gone and resettled in other places and have other nationalities, the Palestinians in Lebanon, who have been there, since the start for 70 years. So whilst a refugee should be a temporary title, for a lot of people, it's not temporary. For a lot of people, it is a permanent title until they can resettle somewhere, or until they can integrate locally where they are. But a lot of countries are resistant to refugees integrating locally. So in Jordan and Lebanon, local integration isn't a part of how they view the Syrian refugee crisis. Even in Lebanon, for Palestinians who've been there it's the second and third generation, they still have very different rights to Lebanese. So it is a very complex situation. So again, this is why I feel digital livelihoods is so important. So the aim of a refugee is just to have a dignified life. That is the aim. Just like our aim, have a dignified life for themselves and for their children. Education, home, food, shelter. That's their aim. So that's why I feel digital livelihoods are important. So even if they can move, whether it's back to their country, whether it's to a third country, they have something they can take with them. They have a job, they have a profession which they can take with them wherever they choose to go, or even if they stay where they are.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that helps give me a little bit more clarity, because I guess I was trying to figure out sort of what the end was, right? So, I mean, if these refugee populations are able to find work through remote means, obviously income and generating money will sort of help, or will allow, maybe afford them some opportunities that they might not have otherwise. And
Exactly.
so that's why I was trying to understand what happens to them if they begin to generate some income. Is there opportunity, I guess, for lack of a better understanding, here in the States, it would be, get your little house with the white picket fence and your safe place to raise your kids and all that kind of stuff, versus, living in a camp, but with an income. I guess I was just trying to understand how that part works.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing in the Middle East, only 10% of refugees live in camps. So most refugees live in the urban community.
Okay.
So if they have a dignified livelihood, they're able to sort of have a normalish life. They can send their children to school. Their children don't have to work to earn money for the family. They can rent an apartment. They can have more of a normal life because they have an income. They don't have to depend on the state or international aid to live.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. That kind of helps me understand that whole situation. So let's shift gears, I guess, a little bit into then how do we start to prep them for this? I mean, obviously, a lot of these people are coming from really difficult situations. As you clarified, the difference between sort of an economic immigrant versus somebody who's a refugee, obviously they're coming from very difficult parts of the world and hopefully moving to somewhere that's at least marginally less difficult. And, but once they've made that move and they begin to sort of settle, just like any family would, right? You'd begin looking for opportunity to improve your situation or to make things better. You mentioned autonomy earlier. I mean, at least in my view, sort of the other aspect of relationships and sort of our mental health is security on top of that autonomy. Yeah. And so, financial means can sometimes, help afford some of that security, or at least to some extent, or the extent whichever is possible. Yes. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just sort of that next step. I'm a refugee. I've safely navigated into another country. I've got some support now. We have a little bit of this security. How do I start making this transition into, I guess, making myself ready to find an opportunity?
Training. So the first step is, what education have you had previously, and then how can we then supplement that education with the skills you need to work remotely? And again, if we look at the Syrian crisis has been 9 years. 9 years. Yeah, 9 years. 9 years. So there's been almost a generation who've missed out on education. So then, in the host countries, they have had opportunity, to integrate into the local education system, but not everyone has had it. But for those who have been able to finish high school, some have been able to go to university. How can we provide the specific skills which are required to access these remote opportunities? So this is one thing, which a lot of countries have done, have been fortunate. So, in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, there have been a lot of initiatives by the international community, by NGOs, by local NGOs, by international NGOs, to provide skills training, whether they're coding boot camps, whether they are, they're trained in digital marketing. There's a lot of, really good training which is happening. So once refugees get into these trainings, they're sort of, being prepped with the technical skills to access this employment. The next step is being able, is having the life skills, the professional skills, the soft skills, to access that. This is when NAMO comes in, providing the soft skills. And then the third, but most important step is access to the jobs. How can we then get companies to hire them? How can we have, how can we create the ecosystem where they can be supported when they are hired? But also, how can we create an ecosystem to support the companies that want to hire them? So this is, I feel, the different steps of the pathway to achieving a dignified livelihood for a refugee.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you're experiencing then in this training aspect? So one thing that occurs to me, and you can tell me if I'm just wrong, is I imagine there might be a little bit of a mindset shift that has to take place here, where you're going from sort of a mode of scarcity to a mode of maybe not abundance, but at least something more than you're used to, right? So you're going from a situation that was really bad to a situation that's okay. But I imagine that there's sort of, a lot of emotional baggage that gets brought along, a lot of fear, a lot of trepidation, things like that, because they don't know when something's going to be taken. And so I wonder, if that presents sort of a hurdle to this training aspect, because it's difficult to sort of fully commit to this new thing and forget all the bad things that happened in the past.
Yeah. So in the current cohort, this is one of the challenges we are facing. Just trying to get across the understanding that yes, the program is intensive, but the only way to really achieve what we need at the end is to stick at it. Really work hard, be dedicated, be committed. But I feel it's the same for any sort of young person transitioning into work. I know when my children transition to work themselves, it will be a mindset shift as well for them, just to understand that it's not going to come easily. You have to really work at it. And perhaps for a refugee, you have to work doubly hard because you have the disadvantages stacked against you. You have language, you have culture. All of these things are, important for you to understand that you need to navigate this in order to get to the ultimate goal of a dignified livelihood. One particular challenge, there are lots of challenges.
Yeah, obviously there's a myriad of issues to work through here.
One particular challenge is language. English is the language of remote work. And a lot of the refugees that we work with, English isn't their first language. And coming from education systems where English hasn't been prioritized, getting them the English level which is required to be able to function in a remote work setting is a challenge. And that's why, we sort of focus on that. So all the training is in English. We have English support as well, apart from the program being in English, just to make them realize that this is what's required. You spoke about autonomy. I think for anyone transitioning into remote work, not a refugee, but anyone, it's very difficult to get your head around organizing your time, around being motivated to get the work done. Often I have I myself, wake up, I wake up early every morning, but at 10 o'clock I'm thinking, oh my God, really, do I have to work now? Sometimes it's really hard to get yourself motivated. And I live in a nice apartment in a nice part of the city. I have my comforts. But for a refugee living in more difficult circumstances, very difficult for them to navigate that space. So it takes a lot of inner strength and determination to do it. And that's why I feel the work we do is important. We can scaffold this journey for them. We can really support them to get, for them to get to be where they need to be globally competitive, because that's the ultimate aim. We don't want them to be hired because a company, I feel sorry for them, they're a refugee. We want them to be hired because it makes good business sense. They have the skills, the technical skills, the professional skills. They have the language skills, English and their native language, so it can help companies who want to access different markets to have someone from that culture speak that language, help them access different markets. But also for companies, they have a more diverse workforce, and as we know with remote companies, that's very important, having a diverse workforce. But also, in a way, for companies, it makes them look better to say, hey, we have a program which supports refugees. So whilst they're doing it for a business purpose, it also makes them look better, probably better, for their customers to think they're working with a company that's more ethical, that's sort of supporting, supporting economic development of other people. But also, more importantly, for a refugee that the company hires, when you hire a refugee, you aren't just impacting that individual person, you're impacting a much larger community. You're bringing money into a community where perhaps there was a lot less money. You sort of, you're allowing the extended family to have a better, a better future. Children have, the children can go to school, have better opportunities for education. Women, you're allowing women access to employment, because a lot of women, again in the Middle East, come from traditional families where they perhaps aren't allowed, or it's perhaps less likely for them to work outside of the home. But you're giving women the opportunity to work from home, but still do their caregiving responsibilities. So providing many advantages. So
Mhm.
whilst I think the challenges are there, and that's what we work on, I want the companies to know that by hiring refugees, you're impacting an entire community, and that's the message that I want, that I want companies to understand.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. One thing I wanted to sort of explore a little bit is, so we've noticed a real difference between the people who work remotely because they choose to, and people
Hmm.
who are sort of have been forced into it, especially now during pandemic. And
Hmm.
so I wonder, for these refugees, just like people have certain inclinations for certain things, some people might lean more towards engineering or more towards tech or more
Hmm.
towards marketing or design or, whatever
Yeah.
their particular inclination is. I wonder, I mean, because maybe options are a little bit more limited to this refugee population. I mean, they can't just maybe well, maybe they can just go down to the local, department store and get a job. But if remote is really being seen as a way to, I guess, sort of bring the workforce to this, disadvantaged population, um, are you finding that in terms of success for your refugees? I mean, is everybody, I guess, sort of rising to the same occasion, or are there opportunities outside of remote work for these individuals as well?
So that's a very good question, and something which requires further investigation. But in terms of local opportunities where they live, in a lot of countries, it is limited because jobs are limited even for the local population. So it's not so easy for them to work at the local shop, is one thing. And also because it's a lot of employers, because, you know, I don't want to say unscrupulous employers, but a lot of employers might perhaps hire a refugee at a wage below the minimum wage because they know that they're really desperate for the work.
Hmm.
So a lot can end up in very precarious conditions because they have very few options.
Okay. Yeah, no,
There's a lot.
that makes sense. And actually it sort of leads me into this next little bit that I wanted to ask you about as it pertains to finding work and opportunities. I mean, are there a lot of, I mean, obviously you mentioned, it's difficult to just go work for the local shop, maybe there's local regulations or something that I think I read in one of your articles,
Mhm.
this concept that it's, maybe for every 10 Turks they hire, they can hire one Syrian
One,
person, for
yes,
example.
exactly.
And so, so there's different regulations around the world for how this is being managed. And you explained earlier why that is. So I mean, I guess you understand it from a practical standpoint, even
Yes,
if
of
it's not
course.
particularly emotional. And
Exactly, completely.
and in a world full of borders, I mean, I guess it just kind of is what it is at the moment. But
Yeah.
but I mean, obviously, I mean, like you mentioned, maybe being paid subprime wages and things like that. I mean, are you experiencing, or your I guess, is this group of people you're trying to help experiencing a lot of issues? I mean, outside of just policy, but I mean, discrimination, tax implications, these sorts of things. Like, I mean, are there a lot of other things that are sort of standing in the way of their success?
When they try to work in the local
Yeah,
economy?
or anywhere. If they're just trying to find work, I mean, maybe locally it's easier to discriminate than it might be maybe online. Maybe you don't know this person and you couldn't draw some sort of
Yeah.
generalized discriminated, attitude about it. But I wonder if refugees are just sort of a specific disadvantage because of their status.
Okay, so locally, getting work in the local economy, yes. Legally, you know, um, and discrimination as well. Working remotely, I think it's just very difficult for them to even understand how to access the remote work ecosystem. So in terms of finding, getting remote jobs, without the support, I'm not sure how many have been able to successfully do it. And I know companies like sort of what's it called, Upwork, and those systems, it's sort of an open platform, for everyone to access work. But I still feel that those entities, it's still very difficult for refugees to break into those, because I mean, I think it's difficult for sort of people with non-traditional backgrounds to access, to get work through those systems. So I feel these things are stacked against us. So that's why I feel that, certainly as the first stage, we need to make the direct links for the company with the individual,
Mhm.
bypass, these platforms, because I think it's very, very difficult, and you can spend loads of time, waste lots of time to with very little result at the end.
Yeah. No, well, and it's interesting, this idea, and you've sort of touched on it a couple times, so maybe it's worth exploring, is this
Mm.
idea that, this opportunity of remote work, like maybe just doesn't even occur to them. And
No, I
it's
don't think it
funny
does.
because for people who have spent a lot of time in and around it, like in my background, I mean, I've been doing, working remotely for more than 20, 25 years at this point.
Mm.
And so for me, it feels so ubiquitous that it's like, well, of course, you find a job online. It's just there. That's
Yeah,
what you
yeah,
do,
yeah.
and so I think, it's probably a little bit insensitive to sort of assume that everybody has this same perspective. And so I think this opportunity to sort of introduce this concept, is really an important part of this step, because I think, especially if you're going to overcome these ideas of scarcity and move
Yes,
into a position where you feel like, oh, well, there's a ton of opportunity out there. I think
yes,
making that shift probably relies a lot on that step of really opening their mind to it. And I guess kind of convincing them that it's real, that there's actually this whole
definitely.
other world out there.
Definitely. I mean, if you think before COVID, the majority of people, never even conceptualized that working remotely is possible. And I remember speaking to companies before COVID, to try to convince them to hire refugees. And like, well, why? We can't work remotely. The concept of working remotely just didn't even occur to companies, far less individuals. So a lot of my friends, they're like, well, how could you work remotely? It's not, you know, not saying it's not real, but it doesn't seem practical for a lot of people, without realizing that a lot of the work that a lot of people do, a lot of sort of knowledge production, isn't dependent on being in a particular place. You can do your work just as well from your living room, from a coffee shop, or from a co-working space. Or from a refugee camp. You don't need to be in an office to do work. And I think COVID has really brought that to people's attention, that I don't need to be in this expensive office building with this crazy air conditioning with people packed around me to do this work. And in fact, I struggle with offices. I mean, I'm not very good at sort of office working anyway, because it's always too cold and it's too noisy.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think COVID has brought to the attention that remote work is viable. It can be done. We
Yeah.
don't need to be sat in an office. So that's the gift I feel that COVID has brought to us,
Yeah.
making companies aware that it's possible. And also, I mean, I sort of understand, for refugees, they're obviously living in places where COVID has sort of, struck them, and they sort of looked around and seen people, in the local economy having worked remotely. So I'm hoping that the narrative is sort of being brought home to them that this is a viable option,
Mm-hmm.
but us providing them the scaffolding to get there would, I hope, make it more realistic for them.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And I think, as you were talking about, sort of this scaffolding, or this, structure that you're
Mm-hmm.
following to sort of give people the training they need, help them understand sort of the soft skill component. I mean, it's, first of all, just learning the programming language, for example,
Yes.
can be a challenge. Doing
Yes.
all that in English is yet
Yeah.
another challenge.
Yeah.
And then, now you've got to try and develop soft skills that sort of translate across cultures, because there's a lot of, just sort of cultural differences that maybe wouldn't be
Completely.
taken for granted. I mean, maybe this is a generalization or a stereotype or something, but I would presume for your average Syrian refugee, they probably don't have a ton of understanding of Western culture. Maybe what they see on TV or in the media or whatever, but I mean, in terms of actual time spent living in and among, sort of Western culture, I imagine that they have somewhat limited experience.
Yeah.
And so that being the case, if they hope to work for let's say an American company, or maybe a Western European company, it makes sense that, there's some cultural learnings there too. And so I think that that's probably a hurdle to overcome.
Yeah, definitely. Cultural learnings, and also remote work learning. So, we've had this sort of challenge in the program we're doing now. We had a meeting with the other partners, and so we found that some of the students were turning up late for their meetings with their mentors. And whilst we say yes, it can be cultural, it's also different in a virtual space. If you turn up late for a face-to-face meeting someone in a coffee shop or an office, 5-10 minutes isn't such a big deal. But in the virtual space, it is a much bigger deal, because it just seems that time is much more, regimented in a virtual space. So things like that, are things we sort of need to teach. But perhaps the same could be said for people who are not refugees, who are working remotely for the first time, the sort of concept of timing with meetings. You
Mhm.
have to be, I mean, I find whilst I can be, I'll happily be 5 to 10 minutes late for a meeting where I'm meeting someone face to face. For a Zoom meeting, I have to be on time.
Yeah.
So,
No, I think
these
that's
things
true.
are,
And that's a great thing to point out. It's funny and it's just sort of anecdotal, but like, for example, with one of my partners in Spain, her joke is that, being on time is being 10 minutes late. Like that's normal
yeah,
for a Spanish person. For
yeah,
me, it's 10 minutes early, right? So
yeah,
we'll meet somewhere in that 20-minute gap.
exactly.
But I think you make a great point that, just in terms of sort of online, I guess, sort of, etiquette, the idea of being late, for example, I mean, here we are, we're doing this video call by Zoom, for example. If I had left you hanging for 5 extra minutes, you start going, oh, well, God, did I
It's
get the
coming.
time wrong? What's going on, whatever. If you're sitting in
Definitely.
a shop and you're just having a cup of coffee, it's okay, I'll give him a few minutes to show up. Maybe he's parking, whatever.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so I think it's true, those distinctions, right? I mean, there is more than just learning sort of, I guess, sort of social etiquette. There is some online specific things that need to be taken into account that sort of, I don't know, it's almost like a new culture that's taking
yes,
place, So you've got sort of
completely.
your cultural understandings, but there's this remote culture as well.
Yeah, and I feel that's one thing that, I know in the early days of remote work, my friends who didn't work remotely, this is one thing they struggle with. Like, how do you navigate this space? How do you sort of change your mindset to work in a space where you're on your own, you're speaking to people on the screen, and I feel COVID has been, it's been quite interesting. I mean, for me, the change hasn't been so great, but the one difference is I don't have the face-to-face interactions.
Mhm.
So, there can be days where the only people I speak to are through the screen. And that's, for me, that's like a huge, a huge thing, because it's, yes, I love my, having meetings on the screen, but I also like face-to-face human contact.
Mhm.
And this has really shown how important both are,
Well,
and how important.
and I think it's a critical distinction too that you're talking about, the difference sort of between a virtual life and sort of one that's face to face. And I mean, I don't myself have a lot of experience with Middle Eastern populations, but as I understand it, they're a very personal culture. They spend a lot
Very
of
much
time
so.
with the people around them, and it's
Yes,
very conversation centric and
yes,
people first oriented. And so
yes,
it's kind of to make the jump from this life that you were living where every interaction you had was in person, whether it was work related or social or whatever, to this new world where, okay, now you want me to spend 8 hours a day on a video screen talking to people and doing this thing. Like, I
yeah,
imagine that's, a hurdle to be overcome. I also
very
think
much
just sort
so.
of in terms of sort of technological adaptation or implementation of technologies, in countries that are sort of more prone to, these in-person interactions. I've seen this with our group in Spain, for example. The in-person relationship is highly important to their group, and
Yes,
it is here too in the States. But this way of working has been something we've been doing a long time, right? So we've become acclimated to it, we understand it. So for people who are just seeing it for the first time, I have to imagine that there's a lot of mental challenges in there. Just, not that it's hard to have a video conversation, but I sort of, and I use this metaphor all the time. Poor listeners to this podcast are going to hear this metaphor about 1,000 times. But it's this idea of sort of, satiation or a glass of water for satiation. And it's this idea that, each of these different channels that we use for communication might be filling our glass to some degree, right? So
yeah,
a text message or an instant message or something might be a drop or two, and maybe an email is an eighth of a glass or something,
yes,
and then a telephone call might be half a glass, and a
yes,
video call, something like this, might be 90%. And we
yes,
could live for a
yes,
long time on this, right? You could spend a lot of
yes,
time meeting people and working this way, and be mostly satiated, mostly able to survive, but I still just sort of think that full glass of water is this opportunity to actually sit down and meet with people. And
completely.
so it's one of the things that we've been sort of exploring a little bit recently in the work that we've been doing is how to, what is the role of your employer in trying to help you find this sort of satiation versus the role that you need to sort of take back and sort of own yourself. So in the case of these refugees, I imagine maybe they spend their time online, but as soon as they're done with that, it's back to family, back to friends, back to
Yes,
whatever, and they try and get
yes,
their social itch scratched in person
yes,
because
yes,
that's their life and that's what they're used to. And
yeah,
so being
completely.
pushed into such an unnatural situation where we're spending our whole days on video conference now, I'm sure has been a difficult transition for those guys, more so than just learning the general etiquette of being a remote worker.
Yeah, completely. I mean, one thing which we're trying to do in this cohort, for the internship, so at least for the first experience, we're trying to have one company hire two. So whilst, they're working remotely for a remote company, at least two of them are together working on a project just to sort of ease the transition into working remotely. So you have you have the camaraderie with someone within your proximity to work with. So that's one way we're trying to ease them slowly into remote work. Mm-hmm. And then after the internship, then hopefully they'll feel more confident to sort of do it on their own, to work completely autonomously, with the remote company.
Yeah. Are there things that you were doing, like, obviously, I mean, in a population like I'm used to working with, burnout is a thing. People get tired, they burn out, stuff like that. I look at this, I think on a surface level, I was thinking initially that, these refugee populations, that like they would be so grateful for the opportunity that they would just, we'll fight through it. We'll just deal with it. But as I sit here and I think, and as we discuss more and more, and I guess, this sounds bad, but, this conversation is making them more human to me. Like I can actually picture the face of these guys a little better than I could have prior to this conversation. I'm wondering, are you guys experiencing sort of levels of burnout and things like that too? Back to this idea of sort of social interaction versus digital interaction and all this stuff. Like, are these guys getting tired and having to overcome sort of these kinds of needs too?
I have to admit, we aren't far enough into our programming to determine that. But again, this is something that we're very aware of, and we'll sort of, look at. And one thing, many of the questions that you have are kind of unanswered and would require research. So, you asked earlier about, do refugees want to work remotely? Perhaps, but we're not really sure. So this is one thing that I'll hopefully be doing research in sort of in early next year, understanding the perception of refugees to work remotely, but also understanding the aptitude of how companies feel about hiring them. So these are sort of elements that need to be researched. But also another big area for research is trying to understand what are the employment outcomes for refugees with digital skills. So we think that refugees who have these skills have good employment outcomes, but we don't really know because there is no evidence to show that this is the case. So hopefully I'll be doing some research to understand this ecosystem, speaking to refugees to understand their perception of this type of work, with this type of training, speaking to companies to understand what they require, how we can better support them, but also looking at the data. What are the employment outcomes for refugees with these particular skills? How does this translate into employment? How does it translate into income?
Well, and I think that maybe is a good topic to dig in a little bit. And so it's this idea that I think for most remote work advocates working under sort of normal conditions, a big component of remote work is that remote work isn't somehow separate and distinct from work. It's just work, right? Exactly. So maybe it's a component, and this flexibility is part of the job, right? It's just part of working. Yeah. And so, and I wonder for like these, refugee populations, where options are so limited, if you start to lose some of that choice, which I guess goes back to our discussion about autonomy, you start to lose some of that choice, and maybe the trade-off is security. You're getting a job and you're getting maybe more security, a little less autonomy because you don't have the choice. But I think for most advocates, you would be advocating for choice. And I wonder too, about refugees workers making the transition to, rather than being a refugee employee, to just being an employee, right? Overcoming sort of this bit where they are the refugee, right? And so, I wonder if this is where some of the challenge might come in, sort of, in and around finding work for these audiences. You mentioned some of the positive byproducts. Maybe there's some social value to supporting a refugee group. Maybe there is, some business attribute, something you could assign to your company that, gives you a little bit of extra equity in the eyes of your end consumers because you're giving X amount of dollars or something to a refugee group. But I think ultimately these refugees are probably looking for kind of normalcy, right? They don't want to be seen as this refugee who, for lack of a better term, has their hand out and needs help. in fact, they would rather get that autonomy, and they would rather be sort of seen as probably just a worker. And so
Exactly.
how do you sort of balance that, that bit where you have an obviously refugee population who needs access to things that they might not otherwise have access to. So I guess, and this sounds kind of bad or sounds a little capitalist, but this idea that your selling point is that we have this opportunity for refugees. But ultimately, we need them to learn the skills and all these things so that they can just become a member of the workforce, a gainfully employed person in the workforce. And
Exactly.
so, I mean, how do you sort of balance that out? Like, when do we need to emphasize this refugee aspect versus when are these just great workers in a pool of great workers?
Yeah. So from the start, the word refugee is only a political title. There is nothing that distinguishes a refugee from you or I, except they have this political label of being a refugee. They've had to flee their home country. That's the only difference. Just like we train someone in North America or in Europe with the technical skills to work remotely, we're providing the same training for refugees. Perhaps the one difference is because they live in vulnerable circumstances, we want to really, explain to the employer that, yes, you have a regular worker. This is a regular worker, no different to the other worker, except they live in slightly more difficult circumstances. They might have, family issues to deal with, but we all do. But just bearing in mind that they have been through something which we can never imagine. They have this level of insecurity and uncertainty with their lives because they have this particular political title. So I want companies to realize that they are no different to a regular worker, but we just have to be aware that they might have slightly different, psychosocial needs. But that, as you do with your work on well-being, we have to look after the well-being of all our employees, refugee or no refugee, whoever they are.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, no, that makes sense.
No distinction. That's the aim, no distinction.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, because that's, I think what I was trying to tiptoe around or kind of get to is that I'm concerned that there might be some biases or things around this idea that, this person is a refugee, therefore they may be somehow less than, or that they may be at some extra disadvantage or something. So I imagine, beyond just sort of racial lines or religious lines or anywhere where people draw distinctions, that this extra layer of refugee could be problematic for them trying to find work.
Yeah. Well, hopefully not. And I feel that, with the way society is moving, companies realize that the diversity in the workplace is important. And, because a refugee is only a political title, it perhaps is no different from hiring someone from a really low socioeconomic background, from a really low social class in a Western context. Perhaps the challenges may be the same. And perhaps a lot of the refugees come from middle class backgrounds. Mm-hmm. They just have, as I say, this political label because they've had to flee their country. So in terms of, disadvantages and sort of prejudices, perhaps no more so than other minority groups.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a fair distinction. And that's what I mean, one thing I'm constantly trying to understand, we talked a little about this, can't remember whether it made the show or if it was a little pre-show, but this idea of being people first, but actually being people first, not just sort of, putting on the look of being people first. And I think that diversity has, unfortunately is one of those things too, right? Sometimes people put on diverse so they look diverse versus just being diverse because that's the way it shook out, right?
Exactly.
And so I think that there's something to that. And so when you're looking at sort of these refugee populations, I mean, obviously you want the diversity in these companies, but I guess, in my mind, and maybe this is too far down the road for now, but it's, I want them to be seen as being an incredible asset to the team. I don't want them be, necessarily getting the position just because they come from a bad background or because they come from a specific racial makeup or, whatever. And so, so I think, there's something to trying to overcome those labels and I guess sort of get to purity of relationship.
Yeah. But also bearing in mind that we need to have all voices represented for things to change. So whilst I agree, we have to hire people because, by skills, sometimes we need to help, sometimes you might have to hire someone with slightly less capacity and build their capacity because they haven't had the opportunity independent of your position, independent of your role, to build the capacity on their own because they come from a disadvantaged background. So we have to be careful how we sort of navigate this space. But the goal is to hire people and help build their capacity. One employer said once some person I spoke to said something great to me. She says, we would rather hire someone who we like their personality, we like the way they interact, with lower technical skills and build their technical skills to what we need, than have someone with amazing skills who we can't get along with them.
Yeah, no, I think that is actually a great distinction, because I think that is so much of what it boils down to when you're hiring, right? And so this, of course, is part of the training, perhaps, in
Exactly.
Not just understanding cultural differences, but understanding, how to sort of let your personality come through, especially if you're doing it virtually.
Yes.
I think that, obviously, people are funny and entertaining and easy to get along with and have all these great personality traits. But sometimes, especially if you're uncomfortable on camera, or, if you don't like the sound of your own voice, which is all of us, or if, if it's any of those kinds of things, sort of, I guess, human problems, then it gets really difficult to sort of, or get out of your own way, I guess, and allow sort of the best parts of you to show. And like you said, maybe you're not a senior developer, but maybe they would take a junior developer who's awesome to work with versus a senior developer that's just a royal pain in the butt.
Exactly, completely. And that's why we feel the soft skills are so important to develop. And the soft skills, as you say, how it translates into the digital world, very, very important to develop.
Yeah. Well, so as we're getting here down sort of to the end of the show, I wanted to maybe talk about then sort of this last phase, right? So there's the, preparation of self, I guess, for lack of a better definition, then sort of this, seeking and finding opportunity sort of thing. And then can we just sort of expand a little bit on sort of that last part? I have found opportunity. Now, what am I doing with it? And what does the future look like for these people?
So the future is continued remote employment. So once they've been through an internship, we need them to be hired, remotely, freelance, part-time, full-time. And this is where my new idea, my new sort of network comes into play. So I want to create a network of remote companies for refugee remote work. How can we create an ecosystem of companies who are engaged, who want to support, but feel individually they're too small to support? All the remote companies that I've spoken to, they sort of, this smallish companies, 20 to 100 employees, perhaps without the revenue to sort of, contribute a large amount to projects, perhaps without the human capital to sort of invest a lot in all the training and support that's required to hire a refugee. But if we can bring all of these companies together in one network, in one coalition, the impact is magnified. So, so the idea is to create an ecosystem of companies. Everyone will sort of pay a small amount, a small entry point from 1,000 to whatever you can afford. Your tiered system, your benefits depends on what tier you enter at. But by being part of this network, we want you to commit to hiring a refugee intern. We want you to commit to being part of our mentorship system to support refugees. But in return, you can get the support you need to hire refugees. Whether it's contracts, whether it's payment, we can provide that support. We'll give you the support you need in terms of training to understand the differences with working with vulnerable populations, to understand the context of these populations. We'll give you support in the mentoring, which you would, which you're being part of. We'll give you sort of support, as well as the training, but sort of support and advice in working with your intern, working with your refugee freelancer, working with your refugee employee. We want to provide you that support so that your impact can be magnified, so that you can take on this person, who you may not have been able to without our support. So we're calling on companies who are interested to be part of our network to support refugee remote work, because I know the companies I've spoken to are all very keen to do it, but they just don't feel they have the capacity on their own. We're creating that capacity together we can do it.
Yeah, I love that. So maybe Lorraine, can you give us just a little bit of like, how do people get involved? Where can they, reach out to you, get in touch, and figure out how they can start to play a role in this? And for both remote workers and employers alike, I think that having some empathy for other remote workers and, maybe through networking and other things like that, you can, provide our own little bit of influence to helping these individuals find work. And then on the other end, employers being open and available to these opportunities. I think, it's sort of this two-way street, right? I think that that's two different groups of people who could be sort of furthering this cause. So, just to sort of wrap up here, how can people get involved? How can they get in touch? What do they need to know?
Contact me, LinkedIn, or maybe you can share my details on the podcast. Get in touch. Let me know what your interests are. And I particularly want companies to be involved, because that's where the difference can be made. There's no point training refugees if we have no companies to hire them. We need companies to hire refugees, to commit to hire, to hire our students. And I have an amazing partnership which is going to start within the next few months, which will have really amazing, high quality graduates. So I can't say who it is yet. It's a new relationship, but I can guarantee that you'll have really high quality graduates who you'd be dying to hire. It just so happens that they're refugees, but in terms of quality, there will be no difference to anyone else. And you can sort of, look good, say, look what I've done. I've hired a refugee, better PR for you, CSR, better for you, but you'll have really amazing talent. So reach out to me, LinkedIn, maybe you can share my email. I don't know if you have notes to the podcast. I'll share the link to NAML. Reach out to us, please. We want companies to engage, because without you, this will not work. Companies are the key for this to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's tremendous. And I think, I would sort of encourage anybody listening to this or any of the work that we're doing at Teammate Apart, please spread the word around, tell your audiences, tell your friends, tell your, friends who work in organizations who might be able to affect change, and get everybody involved who's willing to support, not just NAML, but any sort of group that's attempting to try and elevate the lives of these people in difficult parts of the world, because they need our help. And I think remote work is a great way to leverage that.
And it's sort of part of NAML ecosystem. We're in touch with all different organizations in different parts of the world doing the same thing, with organizations in Europe and Asia, sort of looking at different populations in South America. So, wherever you are, whichever continent or region you want to hire from, we have organizations who are doing the training. Whatever type of job you need, customer service, virtual assistants, transcription, translation, we have people who are doing training to provide you with talent. Just reach out. But we need companies to make the first step to say, I'm committed to this. I will do this. I want to be part of this network.
All right. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much for your time, Lorraine. I really appreciate what you're doing, and I'm hopeful that maybe we can make whatever impact we can make in terms of driving people your direction to get involved. Thanks to everybody who tunes in this week and every week, and thanks so much for tuning in.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been fantastic to speak to you, and let's make this a reality.
I love it. Thanks, Lorraine. Appreciate you.
Thanks, Ryan. You too. Bye.
I don't owe you anything. I don't owe you anything.